Welcome to Oh God, What Now? The podcast that knows how milkshakes have been worn this season. I'm Ros Taylor. On today's show, Farage is running in Clacton, but what's his long game, and why does the man who brought us Brexit still cast a spell over parts of Britain? Plus, who are the people you've barely heard of who will probably be running the country next month? We look at the lesser-known names on the Labour front bench. And in the extra bit for supporters, 6th of June is the anniversary of D-Day, but a majority of young people don't know what it was. Should we be worried? Let's meet the panel. First up, it's author and journalist Marie Leconte. Hello, Marie.
Hello.
Let's talk about Tuesday's leaders' debate.
Oh, yay.
It wasn't edifying, was it?
So, if I were to try and be nice and focus on the silver linings, it could have been worse. I think that's a factual statement. As a debate, it could have been worse.
How could it have been worse, do you think? Serious question.
Serious. If they somehow, I'm sure we'll get into the format in a bit, but maybe if ITV had decided to go for even shorter answers, I think that probably wouldn't have been ideal. And no, but also I think that they both held their own broadly well against one another. So in that sense as well, it could have been worse. There wasn't too much yapping.
Sunak was tetchy and jabby, and Starmer spent a lot of the debate looking outraged at what he'd just heard. Do we need a better format for the next one?
I do think we do. So I'm very sympathetic to the people who say that actually you should not have an audience at all in those debates. You should just have someone moderating the debate and the two politicians, because otherwise they do just end up going for the quite cheap lines and waiting for the applause and for the kind of audience reaction, because they're politicians and that's what they do. So I think A, removing that would definitely help, and B, and again, let me be the 1 millionth person to make that point. It was very silly, the whole, I'm going to ask you a very complex question, and you've run out of time already. It felt like a really weird game show. So I think, just giving them more time and space to kind of talk about stuff probably would have been better. But then, I don't know, I feel like it reminds me of watching clips from old TV shows from the 70s and 80s where you do just have people sitting there for quite a long time, just having quite a long chat. And that probably strikes me as more informative as a voter, to actually, let them be themselves more.
Yeah, it felt like a very complicated game, especially as there was Sunak v Starmer in big letters right next to them, like it was actually a football match of some sort. And that jarred somehow for me, didn't
it? Did,
really
and the general Tron aesthetics as well were just a bit, I think, what was it? Because I think they had a similar one, if memory serves, back in, was it 2015 or 2017? And at the time, there was something a bit of ooh, how novel. Now it's like, it weirdly looks like dated sci-fi. Maybe that's just me.
Joining Marie is political historian and author Seth Thevoz. Hi, Seth.
Hello, hello.
You can't take these debates away now that they're a fixture, but they're actually a recent phenomenon, aren't they?
Yeah, whereas they've been having them in the US since 1960, we were about 50 years behind the times, and we only had our very first debate in 2010. And actually, in the elections since then, we've had them in 2 out of 3 general elections, because Theresa May refused to debate Jeremy Corbyn in 2017. So it's very much something that keeps still being renegotiated every time we keep feeling our way around what the format should be.
Yeah, I'd forgotten about that she refused. Yeah. It's extraordinary, really, isn't it? How would you set them up if you were a Dimbleby and Etchingham? And I have to say, I think, Seth, you would do a fantastic job of moderating this. I think you're born to do this job.
Of being equally rude to everyone. No, I very much agree with Marie that actually some longer, more substantive answers would be desirable. I know that they're worried about ratings and they want to make these things a bit more jazzed up and interesting, but I think what would help is if you had a brutal amount of discipline about time limits and cutting off people's microphones if they overrun, which is actually a condition in the US of the forthcoming debates that they've got because Donald Trump. But also, I think you could pair that off with giving the moderator carte blanche to nip in, and as long as they do it fairly, pick up in the middle of somebody's flow and say, I need to pick you up on that, and just ask on this. That could jazz it up. They also go some really interesting lengths about having everybody appear equal on stage in the US. So, for example, they're interested in what the candidates are wearing, that there's disparity on these kinds of things, and how tall they are. In 1976, the Jimmy Carter camp was so worried that President Gerald Ford was so much taller than their candidate that they insisted that the President of the United States should stand in a hole in the ground.
Does this potentially affect the Sunak v Starmer, the whole height issue?
No comment.
No comment. Okay, that's very tactful of you. And finally, our guest today, and returning to the podcast, is journalist for the iPaper, Rachel Wearmouth. Welcome back, Rachel.
Hello.
The debate didn't really play to Starmer's strengths, did it? What does he need to do better next time?
I kind of agree with Marie, actually. I thought they kind of both got their points across quite well. I think what I would say is that it kind of shows that Keir Starmer's a little bit better at attacking than he is defending. So when Rishi Sunak came at him with the claims these £2,000 tax rises that Labour is apparently plotting, he didn't respond to that straight away, and that allowed the situation to develop throughout the course of the debate, really. And I think if he was a little bit more deft at defence, that would be something that was dealt with earlier, definitely.
Yeah, because Sunak kept on saying it over and over again, and it took quite a long time for Starmer to actually get back. And when he did, he sounded very angry, which again jarred, because if you felt that indignant, you would have come in earlier.
I think that's right. I don't know if during the break there was some kind of conversation with his team that he was told that he needed to shut it down. I suspect that may have been what happened. But yeah, you need to respond to something like that straight away, because obviously, and I can't see how that wasn't anticipated either, because it was unlikely that Rishi Sunak would go on defence, although that did come up. And one of Labour's biggest weaknesses would be the economy. So you would kind of think that would be something he should have been prepared for, really.
Yeah. Has Sunak learnt from his leadership debates with Liz Truss? Because he kept interrupting her, and he did the same again this time with Starmer.
Yes, and it's really, really annoying. And I can't imagine anybody watching it would have thought that it was particularly effective either. I watched, actually, the Scottish leaders debate earlier in the week, and the quality was just so much better, and it was more polite, more courteous, and the format was different in that leaders had to field questions from the audience, but the only time they were able to kind of interject on one another was basically when they had these sections where the point of it was to ask each other questions. And I kind of think that worked a little bit better and mixed it up a bit.
Well, we'll see how I think, seven-hander at the end of this week with Penny Mordaunt and Angela Rayner and, of course, Nigel Farage goes. Before we start, don't forget our election night live show on Thursday the 4th of July. I will be joining Dorian and Alex, plus a special guest to be announced, live on stage in London for the endgame of this particular political nightmare. It's happening at the Tabernacle in Powis Square, Notting Hill, and we're starting at 8:30pm and going through to 10:30 in order to catch the exit poll results, so we can all experience a great, we hope, moment in history live together in the room. There might even be confetti cannons if the result goes the right way. And as a special bonus, Oh God What Now regular and comedian Matt Green will be bringing his close personal friend, Tory MP, the Right Honourable Jeffrey, along to reflect on the many successes of this Conservative government. Tickets are on sale now. There's a link in the show notes and they are going fast, so get yours now. It will be more than a night to remember. It will be a night to go down in history, and we want you there with us. Get your tickets now. We'll see you there. It was the worst possible news for the Tories. Nigel Farage is making his 8th attempt to become an MP, this time in Clacton. Is this country really still susceptible to the Farage brand, even after what they've seen of Brexit? And what is this going to mean for the Conservatives? Seth, the latest big MRP poll for Best for Britain gives Reform just 3 seats. Where are those likely to be?
They do caveat it because they say that actually their projections currently show Reform not in the lead in a single constituency, but they've got something like a 4 out of 5 chance of them winning in Clacton, in Gainsborough, and in Northwest Norfolk. They also have a pretty good score for Reform UK in Boston and Skegness. I mean, these are all seats where they're currently projected to win about 25% of the vote, but you need 35% to vote to win in these seats. That is doable if you've got a strong local campaign. Reform UK, like UKIP before them, are fantastic at fighting air war campaigns and terrible at fighting constituency campaigns. So we'll see how that pans out.
So it's really in the East where they're flourishing.
Where the Brexit vote was its highest, and indeed where Brexit remains very popular today.
Why does a party that's likely then to pick up so few seats pose such an existential threat to the Conservatives?
Because of the effect of this under our first past the post system. If you cast your minds back to the last landslide defeat for the Tories coming out of power in 1997, it's thought that the referendum party, another populist right-wing Eurosceptic party, had a crippling effect that may have cost the Tories at least 50 seats. Their total poll was 2.6% in that election. Currently, Reform UK are polling around 11 or 12%. They have polled around 16% very recently. It's not inconceivable they could easily poll around that number. It's not even unimaginable that they could poll sort of more like 18 or 19%. These are catastrophic numbers for the Conservatives when you start to see them panned out in every constituency, because the vast majority of that vote is at the expense of the Tories. If they weren't there right now, Sunak's Conservatives could easily be on 35%. It would be a much closer election with the Labour Party. The Labour Party might only be on 40%. It wouldn't be that large a lead. We're now looking at a major Labour landslide because of the division of the Tory vote. And you may well find that actually you're looking at the Conservatives being outpolled by Reform UK in a significant number of constituencies of the UK.
And the risk, of course, is that because voters probably thought that Nigel Farage was already leader of the Reform Party, when in fact he wasn't, he is now, suddenly start paying attention and think, oh yeah, we will turn out, he's going to make a bit of a splash.
Yeah, I mean, Farage is one of these deeply divisive people who is despised by a large segment of the electorate, but is total catnip for a large segment of the electorate. And those are the people the Tories should be hoovering up. They've started Sunak's leadership with a sort of broadly one nation Tory pitch, and they've receded towards trying to hold on to this very strongly Brexit vote. But the idea that they might not even be able to hold on to that in this election is a disaster for them.
Rachel, my heart sank a bit when Farage announced he was standing, because I know his ability, as Seth was just saying, to grab the attention of the media. And it felt as though the whole campaign had just got that bit dumber. Do we pay Farage too much attention? I mean, just as we are right now talking about him. Is there any way to stop doing this?
I actually think it's the job of the Tory left to vanquish that dragon, basically, and it's never really faced up to that task. I think that there's a kind of instinct in both the parties, isn't there, that sometimes the left looks for traitors and the right looks for allies, and they're never going to find an ally in Nigel Farage. And there are many in their party. Andrea Jenkins would be one, for example, who kind of look to Farage to be an ally of some kind, when really they just have to have that fight. And I'm not sure anybody else can do it for them.
Do Reform voters really care whether he comes up with a plausible plan to cut migration or not? I mean, it's their big obsession. Everyone says what Reform voters care about more than anything else is immigration. So you would expect them to be interested to hear what he has to say. But are they?
A credible plan. No, that's not really what Nigel Farage does. He grabs headlines, grabs the attention. He doesn't make a significant and useful intervention when it comes to policy. He wanted a referendum on net zero. It was never going to happen. He was going to get a lot of headlines. And similarly, what he wants, net zero immigration. I mean, it's not achievable, is it? But that's not the point of what Nigel Farage does.
Marie, what is Farage's game plan? Because he must know a Labour landslide puts him on the sidelines for a while.
Well, I mean, with the caveat that I have not spoken to my close personal friend Nigel over the past few days. But my guess is actually that his current game plan is, why not? In that I suspect that, like everyone else, he assumed that the election would actually be in September, October, November, December, in that kind of second half of the year. But crucially, while the US election was going to happen, and Nigel Farage was clearly looking to, towards the US over the past few months, I think he was clearly trying to go stateside and do Republican-y, CPAC-y kind of stuff. And then obviously the election got called here, and it was a bit like, well, it turns out I've got a few months spare, so I might as well give that a go. Like, I genuinely think there's probably not much more to it than that. It's just like, why not do it? And on your point of saying that, that the Labour Party is about to be the next government, like, that is very true, but also that means that they will be in dire need of opposition. And I think that, if Nigel Farage now tries to position himself as the person on the kind of capital R right, especially as we know that after the election, it is very likely the Conservative Party will just tear itself apart in the leadership contest and in the months that follow. So if Farage can just be there being like, well, hello, probably like still have a drawn to the US, but then come back and be like, as you know, I'm still here, I'm still me, and I'm kind of this great constant in British politics. So I think it actually kind of makes sense for him to be there, annoyed as I am that he is there.
Because he did have a very firm job offer, apparently, from Donald Trump. And now, I mean, if he does get elected to Clacton, he really can't go over to the US all the time and campaign for Trump. Or can he? Maybe he can.
I mean, he can. Who's going to stop him? Yeah, no, but generally, who's going to stop him? Like, his party is just some weird company that's entirely, so like private and stuff, and which he mostly owns. They won't, like, it is really unlikely there'll be other Reform MPs in Parliament. If there are, he'll be the leader. So, like, generally, like, not being facetious here, but, like, who would be there to stop him from just being like, lads, I will be back. Like, I'm just, going to do this. But I did enjoy the theory. I can't remember who came up with it, of saying that actually, so Farage saw the result of the Trump court case and went, actually, maybe this is not as much as a done deal as, like optimistic right-wingers thought it would be in the US. So maybe, I can not have my eggs all in the same basket. So, yeah, it may be that as well.
I think if he was an MP, he would have no qualms about going over to America and being there all the time. I mean, look how many expenses he claimed when he was a UKIP MEP.
I was just going to say, have you seen his record as an MEP? He was constantly being criticised for maxing out his spending, but never being there.
Yeah, no, obviously I overestimate his sense of probity and duty. Marie, he has been, as we say, greasing up to Trump, and he's also been hailing the populist parties that are likely to do well in the European Parliament elections later this week. Is that part of the plan?
Well, I think we do know for a fact that there's clearly like formal and informal kind of networks across the world, especially I think, it sounds like someone's grand, but the internet era. But you know what I mean, right? Social media and these kind of like big, slightly shadowy companies, and that individuals are clearly coordinating across the world to push a lot of reactionary stuff in different countries. And we have no way of knowing for certain, but he's either actively part of those groups and networks as it is, or he's clearly trying to muscle his way into them. So it does, I think, make sense for him to try and kind of again, put his fingers in as many pies as possible.
Because he'd love it if the EU ceased to exist in any meaningful way, wouldn't he? I mean, that is one of his big, bucket list objectives in life.
But also, I think he just loves attention. So I think wherever he can get attention, he can be Mr. Brexit man, which I think lots of right-wing parties across the world would be like, hey, we love Brexit, Mr. Brexit man. So he's got quite a straightforward, personal brand, which helps.
It's weird, isn't it? Because, it's really hard to understand how that could be a net positive. But perhaps if you don't live in Britain, you do see something we don't. Seth, let's assume that MRP poll is about right, and the Tories are reduced to 70-odd seats after the election, maybe as many as 90. How will the party react and regroup?
Assuming that's the case, it really depends on which 70 to 90 MPs survive. But given that it's unlikely on the current majorities to be the Penny Mordaunt's of this world who survive, and it's more likely to be the Kemi Badenochs who survive, you can see how all the predictions of a further lurch to the right are highly likely. One of the things that I begrudge as a historian all the time is how we have the memory of goldfish bowls when it comes to this. And again, the response of the Tories after the 97 landslide was, we didn't go far to the right enough. So after John Major, we really need William Hague. And after William Hague, we haven't gone further to the right enough. We really need Ian Duncan Smith. And you can see something like that panning out very feasibly, because I don't see anyone moderate in the Tory party who is being touted as a feasible leadership candidate who would have their seat after this election.
We know the Conservatives have dabbled in populism, to put it mildly, but are they really ready for a Farage takeover? Do you see the possibility of some kind of merger?
Oh, absolutely. And it's in some ways the logical conclusion of where their activist base has been for a while. If you spend several decades pursuing a Farage-light agenda, don't be surprised if when you offer your voters the real Nigel Farage, they say that's even better. But part of this is actually how the Conservatives have dealt with UKIP a decade ago and with Reform UK in the last 5 years, because they've suffered very heavily from seeping activists and members to these parties. And whereas all through the, let's say, the Michael Foot years and the Jeremy Corbyn years, the Labour Party took the attitude, we're not standing for trots, we're not standing for actual breakaways to other parties. You put up your lot with militants in the 1980s and you are not coming back to the Labour Party. That is not the Conservative attitude to these parties. In fact, there's very much been a blind eye turned to this. I know of some Conservative associations where they say all of our officers and even our MP voted Reform UK or Brexit Party as it was in the European elections of 2019. This was only 6 months before Boris Johnson's own election victory. And the way that they managed to muster together was just by turning a blind eye to people sort of having a foot in both camps on this. And so there's an idea in the Conservative Party today that actually it doesn't matter too much if you fully support Nigel Farage and his crusade. So the idea that they are ripe for a takeover by Farage, let's say Farage becomes the MP for Clacton under the Reform UK banner, and let's say he joins the Conservative Party after the next election. It's not actually inconceivable that he wins a Tory leadership in this Parliament.
But surely if you're...
I disagree, I think. I don't think you would have the numbers in the Parliamentary Conservative Party, even after the election, or unless there's something very specific that happens on the 4th of July where somehow all the moderates lose and all the nutters kind of stay, which feels unlikely if you look at the polling at the moment. I still think, because if you look at One Nation Tory MPs, are still that at the moment the crushing majority of the Parliamentary Party, I think. So I wouldn't see it. I don't think... I wouldn't see it happen because I don't believe he has the numbers. But B, why would you want to do it? Because again, we're just saying he can become an MP and then fuck off to the US for 3 months if he wants and be like, well, who's going to stop me? Like you and whose army? Whereas if he joins the Tories, then suddenly he can't do that anymore. So I would, I
think he would have the numbers.
He's pissing all over the tent at the moment, has been doing for a decade. Why would you get inside the tent? Because it's piss soaked.
I mean, I agree with the analogy, but I think he would have the numbers because not only the effects of this likely election and the steamroll of the Parliamentary Conservative Party, but look at the last contest they had. And so many Tory MPs voted for Liz Truss. Was it because, hand on heart, they thought she was the best person to lead the Tory party? Or was it because, as the standard bearers for the right got fewer and fewer in number, it was a matter of, I suppose she's the only one who's a viable option for us?
I think she was always going to win with the membership, and Tory MPs know which side their bread is buttered. So they just supported the candidate who was going to win anyway because they wanted jobs.
That's why I think they would go for Farage.
But surely, if you were a Conservative MP who'd survived, you would be furious with Farage for what he'd done and how he'd basically almost wiped out your party, wouldn't you? Wouldn't you?
Yeah, but fury is a natural order of politics these days.
I just never conceived of the Conservative Party as quite that malleable. I thought it was more of an abiding institution, but perhaps you're right, Seth.
Well, I think, I'm not sure I agree either. I think there are lots of, say, Conservatives in Scotland or in Northumberland who are very pro-union, very pro the establishment essentially, and would see Farage as a threat to that. I think his competition for the job would be Kemi Badenoch, who will, unless the Conservative Party is completely wiped out at the election, will hang on to her seat. And she's very against Nigel Farage joining, and says, he's kind of taken the party apart and he's stood against us numerous times. Why would we take him into the Conservative Party? And I just think she's described herself as like a Conservative, not an arsonist. And I think there are probably quite a lot of Conservatives who've been with the party much longer that, I don't think they'd necessarily welcome Farage at all.
And if you look as well, just finally on that point, I think at the few remaining safe Tory seats where MPs are standing down, nearly all of the ones who've been selected are actually quite centristy. I think the kind of centristy wing of the party has been doing quite well at kind of quietly just putting not entirely insane people in those seats. So, so I think, numbers game and all that. And we'll see. Only time will tell.
Let's see who survives.
Yeah, and you never know what a traumatised party's going to do. It's really hard to predict. No one would have predicted Jeremy Corbyn in 2015,
If reform do surge during this campaign, what do Labour need to learn from that? Because, you could just say, right, we've won a landslide, whatever, screw them. But there are things to learn from that, aren't there?
Well, it's hard to predict quite what the victory would look like at the moment. But I don't know. I'm not sure Labour would necessarily see that it was their issue to engage with. I think they'd probably see it as a Conservative Party problem and would be quite happy for the division to play out and let them get on with business, really.
But it is a problem, isn't it? Up to 20% of the population, voting for a populist party.
I think they'd probably look at the issue of immigration and think that that's something that they need to deal with. I thought it was quite interesting last night. Keir Starmer kind of have the strongest words yet on processing asylum claims in another country, which I thought was quite interesting. They're obviously taking the issue of immigration quite seriously, and that has played out in terms of their policy with the EU. You know, it's not going back in the single market and not going back in the customs union is something they're sticking to this election. That's because they're prioritising immigration as an issue. So I think it's probably already had an impact.
Marie, what do you think is the essence of Farage's appeal to reform voters? What's he got that really cuts through to them? Is it pure personality? And if so, what is the personality that they love?
I'm not, part of me just wants to say, I am the wrong person to ask. But no, so I think that the one thing I will give Farage is that he's one of the very few politicians who seem to genuinely enjoy politics. He likes talking to the press. He likes arguing against people, be that voters or, other politicians, etc. He clearly enjoys the business of politics, and you get the sense that also he's not especially calculating. He's not always trying to triangulate or think about the line the party gave him, then he has to shoehorn in somehow, etc. He's kind of just there, and that's clearly appealing to especially, I think, a certain tranche of voters who are quite anti-politicians anyway. So he is different. It is fair to say he is different from, let's say, Rishi Sunak or Keir Starmer or, David Cameron back in the day, etc. So I think that there is that thing of what you see is what you get with him, which I think, again, those kind of reformy voters tend to probably quite like in a politician because they don't like politicians.
Now let's have some questions from our Patreon backers in But Your Emails. If you support us on Patreon, you too can submit a question for the panel. Make it a good one. First up is Close to My Heart from Jasper Alexander. Question for the whole panel, he says, but particularly keen to hear from Ros. Thank you. Which frontline politicians do you truly trust and why? Seth?
I think from either party I'd pick Stella Creasy from Labour and Bob Neill from the Tories. They're both thoughtful, independent-minded. I don't always agree with them, but I absolutely respect their integrity, and they usually come up with a very good reason for why they hold a particular opinion.
How about you, Marie?
I think I'd go with Jess Phillips, actually. I was thinking about it earlier, and I think purely because she doesn't strike me as someone who would lie because she's probably not very good at it. The number of times Jess Phillips has said stuff and you're a bit like, your life would have been easier if you'd not said that, mate. So I think, that there's clearly something very earnest about her, which I find quite endearing.
Are there any Conservatives we sort of trust up to a point, if not truly?
I would say Caroline Noakes, weirdly for similar reasons to Jess Phillips. I think that's someone who's got herself in trouble several times for just saying stuff she probably shouldn't have said. And usually feminist issues, so I'm biased, but she does strike me as someone who's actually just quite honest and trustworthy.
From my point of view, because I know, Jasper, you were keen to hear from me, I tend to not wish to trust politicians, and I guard against doing so. Which is not to say that I'm incapable of trusting a politician enough to vote for them, but I would not truly trust them. I think if I do get to that stage, it tends to sort of corrupt my judgment, so I avoid doing it. And my answer, I'm afraid, is that there is no politician, and there would be none under any circumstances that I would say I would truly trust, because in my view, it's dangerous to do that. Next up, David Bunce. If, as many polls predict, he says, Starmer does indeed get a huge majority, party discipline in government is likely to be tricky because there are not enough ministerial jobs to go around. What will Starmer need to do in order to keep focused on delivery rather than everything descending into a supply teacher on a rainy Thursday afternoon level of chaotic infighting? What do you think, Rachel?
Well, I think what you've seen from the Starmer operation is making sure that he gets lots of MPs in there who are going to have a lot of loyalty to him in the future. That's what kind of a lot of the machinations have been about over the last week. I think that's probably beneficial to him. I think having a very strong whip's office is going to be important. I think Holly Lynch stepping down as Deputy Chief Whip will probably be in a bit of a blow in that respect, because I think she was seen as being very good at that job. I wonder if perhaps they might put Luke Akehurst in the Whip's office, which is kind of known as a bit of an operator, even if divisive for some.
That would be an interesting move, wouldn't it?
It would be an interesting move, but I wouldn't be surprised if it happened.
Seth?
I'm reminded of an old colleague of mine, Myron Rogers, had a saying, which is that people own what they create. And I think it's really important that you give MPs a sense of ownership, because if they're just festering on the backbenches, disempowered and discontented. That's how you get rebellions. So I think the best possible thing the next Labour government could do with their backbenchers is to give out a whole number of Tsar positions on a whole number of single issues and actually keep them
that's
busy.
the Gordon Brown way, isn't it?
which is not a bad thing to do, and it's often a very good way of pursuing single issues that get overlooked. I mean, take something like, I don't know, online bullying is constantly overlooked by governments. You don't need legislation to necessarily put it right, but you can find that a few active backbenchers, one or two, making a go of it, can really raise progress on that, and it can be something that uses the convening power of Parliament.
Yeah, so things that otherwise they would perhaps be trying to put forward a private member's bill and failing, but this gives them the opportunity to get much higher profile. Yeah.
I think my main thing is that over the past few years in opposition, Keir Starmer has been very good at using a lot of stick with his MPs. And that's worked quite well because, again, the polling kept getting better and better, etc. The carrot will have to be introduced at some point. It's not, and I think we've seen that, and I know we're not really going to get into that now, but with the kind of like selection hoo-ha, you can't just run a party with an iron fist forever, especially as, it's probably going to be a very large parliamentary party and, they're going to be quite busy running the country. It is not, as the Tories have shown recently, it is not hard to actually for everything to explode, even if you have a massive majority. So I think, and I realise this is not an entirely helpful answer, but what they need is to realise that they're probably about to have a problem on their hands, and it's not clear to me that they have.
I would agree with that. I think the expectation as well is that a lot of the newly elected MPs, many of them very experienced and have had big careers outside of Parliament, are quite likely to make it onto the front bench in short order. And that means that you have some people who would have been elected in 2019 will be roaming around and not very happy.
Or even a bit like, imagine you were elected in 2015. You've been like, you've been an MP for nearly a decade, and like you're probably going to get overlooked. Most of them probably are because you've been there for ages. You're kind of part of the scenery. You'll get annoyed. Like you will get peeved, you think.
Yeah, that's Stella Creasy's problem exactly, isn't it? Because she was elected quite a long time ago and she's been waiting a long time for this moment. And finally, Kath Keats. Is there any scenario, she says, that doesn't result in the Tories lurching even further to the right after the election? As much as I want to see the Tories have their asses handed to them, I am genuinely worried about what the shift in the Overton window might look like under a Badenoch leadership. It is my strong suspicion that free from the shackles of responsibility, a truly rabid Tory opposition will go all out for the culture war. Can anyone ease my concern? Now, of course, we touched on this with talking to Seth earlier about what direction the Tories will take. But are any of us optimistic that it might not go that way?
That's weirdly, I feel like a hill. Like I've been standing on that hill for a good 6 months to a year, waiting to die on it. I'm not convinced. I mean, I think they'll go a bit mad because literally every single party that goes into opposition after a long spell in government will go a bit mad. But I'm really not seeing what everyone else is seeing of like, oh, they're going to go full fascist and, and Kemi Badenoch will be leader and it'll be like incredibly right wing and stuff. If you look at the MPs who are probably going to stay in the parliamentary party after the election, a lot of them are not nutters, and actually a lot of the kind of the real cream of the crop of the nutters are all going to leave. Like nearly all of them are losing their seats. And on Kemi, I don't know. Again, I wonder if there's something everyone is seeing, but I'm not. But I don't see it as certain at all that she's going to win. I think someone like James Cleverly actually probably has a better pitch to win the next contest. So yeah, no. Again, I feel like it's just people are kind of seeing points and maybe making too many deductions and reaching a point that, again, to me is definitely a possibility, but I don't see it as the only one.
I think those are some really good points. I also think that the parties had more time to plan than it might have done. This is not a competitive election. It's not like the polls are remotely close. So the party's having a long time to think about how it copes with the next moment. There's not the result's not going to be a huge surprise. So the reaction might not be as dramatic and lurchy to the righty as you think it might be.
I'll also suggest one other scenario. It's not the most likely one, but if Reform UK actually does really well, if they were to actually outpoll the Tories in the popular vote, which I think is unlikely but not impossible, at that stage, you can't have two parties pitching for the same hard right position. And actually, the only space left for the Conservatives is in the right of centre.
If we can believe the polls, deep breath, Labour is going to form the next government. Who are the men and women who are about to run the country? Hardly any of them have served in government before, and even geeks like us struggle to name all of the shadow cabinet. Then there are the people who aren't standing for election but who are already shaping Labour's policies, the backroom team. Marie, most people have heard of David Lammy, but many won't know of John Healey, the Shadow Defence Secretary. That could end up being a key job very quickly, depending on whether Trump is elected and NATO has to change and reform. What do we know about Healey? You've interviewed him, haven't you?
I have. So John Healey's got an interesting chap. So he's in his 60s, so not very young. So he's a former journalist turned disability rights activist turned trade unionist. So I feel like he did a fair bit before entering Parliament. Perhaps most crucially, he first ran in 92 and lost, but then ran again in 97 and won. So he actually has quite a lot of experience of government. So he was Housing Minister of State for quite a long time. He was Financial Secretary to the Treasury. Like, he worked under both Blair and Brown. So that's someone who's definitely spent a lot of time in power and kind of knows how stuff works, which, and I think is going to be such a fresh-faced Labour government that they'll definitely need people like him, I think, all hands. But yes, no, I did do a very fun interview with him back in 2020 and can tell you 2 fun facts about him.
Hey.
The first one is that when he was in his 20s, he sailed across the Atlantic on a sailing boat, not really knowing what he was doing with random strangers, which I really respect. Like that. And yeah, and he's basically like, he was like, apparently the way there, the winds were great and the people were really nice. It went super well. And and the way back, he was like, I basically got on this boat. Turns out the other guy didn't really know what he was doing either. And it took us like 47 days or something. So that's quite fun. And the other one is that when he was 18, he worked for the Bishop of Swaziland in Swaziland and as his driver and kind of carrying the vestments around to the little villages where he would do some bishoping, I guess. So that I would say an interesting character. And also, as far as I can tell, just quite broadly liked. Like, I've never heard a bad word about John Healey, just like quite a pleasant chap.
Which is probably why we hear so little about him.
Exactly.
Tell us about the education shadow, Bridget Phillipson. Unlike a lot of MPs, she spent almost all her life in the region where she was born, I think with the exception of going to Oxford University. She's been in the northeast all her life, hasn't she?
She has. And also the interesting thing about her is that she became a member of the Labour Party at 15 and became a member of Parliament at 26 or 27. But she's not insane, because I feel like most people who do that, then you meet them and you're like, oh, you're peculiar. Like, there's a reason why you found politics and never left. I'm actually a big fan of Bridget. So during the kind of Corbyn wilderness years, she ended up writing these really long essays for the New Statesman on kind of the state of the left and like policy stuff, whatever, which were amazing. Like, it's not fully clear to me that anyone but me read them. But I, as the reader of those many long essays, I really, really enjoyed them. Like, she's clearly very astute and very clever and thinks about policy in like some depth. I would say she's not maybe always the most charismatic person. Like, she's not one of those politicians who'll just enter any room and kind of like chatter on, be like, hello, hello, hello. Like, she doesn't quite do that. But also, again, I feel like maybe as Secretary of State for Education, you don't really need that. So no, I think she's a solid, like, probably not a next kind of like leadership contender, but would make a really solid Secretary of State.
Seth, how many of the likely new cabinet actually have experience of government now?
A fair few, actually. I mean, just amongst the Labour shadow cabinet, there are half a dozen. You've got Yvette Cooper, David Lammy, Ed Miliband, Pat McFadden, Hilary Benn, and of course John Healey. They've all served in government before. It's worth saying that it's actually not that unusual for an incoming Labour government. Bear in mind, of course, the Conservatives have been in power for 2/3 of the last half century. So whenever you get an incoming Labour government, you'll usually say, well, not many of them have been in office before. They're not used to it. Tony Blair had barely anyone in his ministerial team who'd been in office when Labour was last in power 18 years earlier. When Harold Wilson becomes Prime Minister in 1964, the Prime Minister is the only member of his cabinet who's ever served in government before. So that's not that particularly unusual. But I think the corollary of these sorts of discussions is very often, they're inexperienced, they're going to have to learn a lot on the job. We've not really seen many scandals historically come about from somebody who's quite new to the job. It's not a problem by and large.
Because it takes a while for them to become accustomed to the Westminster ways and sucked into the vortex of depravity that is.
Well, also remember that even when you've got Conservative ministers continuously in government, they're appointing new people to government all the time, and they don't, by and large, have scandals coming about from inexperience.
I think it is also worth saying that things are getting a lot better on that front. So, for example, the Institute for Government over the past few years has really tried to step up its training of future ministers and future governments. And I think it's been open in saying that it has been in talks with Labour for some time now, trying to train people and saying this is how Whitehall works and stuff, which is not something that used to happen at all in the past. So I think actually this is a group of people who will come in having already a sense of kind of what they're getting themselves into, which I think had never happened before. Which is, good for them.
Seth, Labour has been imposing candidates pretty hastily in lots of seats since the election was called. Some of these are people that Keir Starmer obviously really wants in government, although perhaps not in the cabinet just yet. Who are the most interesting?
I mean, it depends what you mean by interesting, because actually we often rue the lack of people with life experience who are in politics, and these ones, as well as the ones who have showy CVs, can be just as interesting. But a clear example would of the sort of policy heavy approach would be someone like Torsten Bell, who's been parachuted in Swansea West. He's chief exec of the Resolution Foundation at the moment. He's an economist, forever to be mocked as the guy who came up with the Edstone. But to be fair, being a press officer is never really his strong point. Being an economist, actually, is something that I think he could contribute to very well as a government official. But this has, I think, also hit the Labour leadership quite badly in other ways. We've seen the tussle over the selection in Chingford and Woodford Green and the unseating of the Labour candidate, Faiza Shaheen. Whether you agree with her views or not, she is a substantive economist in her own right, and actually would have been somebody who probably would have been a dissenting voice on the backbenches, let's say. But you could argue that the Labour Party is poorer for not having people like that who are thoroughly impressive on the Labour benches.
You suggested the other day the Labour talent pool isn't quite as big as some people say. What made you say that?
I think there's been a lot of interest on the kinds of things we've just been talking about, the Premier League division of the people who, are destined for the cabinet one day as far as the selection contest is concerned. But actually, when you go below it, there are an awful lot of candidates who are being picked, who are sort of lifelong Labour Party officials. Now, some of them may have very, very interesting life stories to tell, but you get the sense that this is the kind of election where a lot of people are going to be accidentally elected in seats that weren't considered very winnable. They didn't really look too hard to get a heavyweight candidate for the seat, and they're going to find, oh God, we're lumbered with somebody who's a complete idiot now. And that may happen, I'm afraid, in a few seats.
Oh, no, I just wanted to come in talking about Labour MPs. We're not talking about enough, but at least normal people don't really know about because they have a life. I think Chion Wora is absolutely brilliant. She's the Shadow Minister for Science, Research and Digital, and has this incredible life story. So she's of Nigerian descent, and I think was born here, but then went to Nigeria and then came back when the Biafran War began, ended up becoming an engineer, so in the north of England, kind of across the world and stuff, and then became a Labour MP, and is just clearly, has a proper background in a real life kind of job, and is really really interesting. And I will say is kind of a character as well. She's also, I think she's both very clearly clever and across her brief, but also one of those people you really want to bump into at 1 a.m. at Labour conference, because you'll definitely have a fun chat with her.
Yeah, she was on a commission that I worked for at one point, and she's very, very good on technology and those kinds of issues.
Yeah, especially when I think so many MPs in Parliament are just very bad at anything techie. So it's a bit yay. So, at least 3 of them, know what they're talking about.
Let's talk about the people behind the scenes who aren't actually standing for the election. There's Sue Gray, of course, the former senior civil servant who wrote the report on Johnson's partying and is now Starmer's chief of staff. Who are the other key players?
Well, there's quite a lot of them. The one you hear about the most, obviously, is Morgan McSweeney. Is the very well-known, well-liked director of the campaign. Big question mark of what he does next. So it's a little bit of speculation at one point that he was going to become an MP, but obviously not if he's going to run the campaign. But he's been with the Starmer's operation since basically the beginning, basically. Formed Labour Together, which is the part of the whole strategy for Labour's re-election and becoming a more credible party. So he's a key person. Luke Sullivan, who's Keir Starmer's political director, his fixer, worked for the chief whip once upon a time, been around a very long time, very experienced guy. I think someone who is very influential and doesn't get talked about much is Mariana McFadden, who's actually Morgan McSweeney's deputy campaign manager. She was in Number 10 during the Tony Blair years, and I wouldn't be surprised if she came on to have a role within within the operation. But then you also have people like Paul Ovenden, who's the director of Attack and Rebuttal. There's a lot of them.
And one entire woman as well. I'm so impressed.
There's obviously Matt Doyle, his director of communications, will be staying on as well. So,
do you think they'll all stick around after the election? Because winning an election and governing, two different things.
Oh, this is the $1 million question, isn't it? I mean, a lot of people would say that they find Keir Starmer quite inscrutable, and lots of people who go through quite a bruising campaign make a lot of changes afterwards. I don't think anyone knows for sure what those changes will be at the moment. Yeah.
Marie, as survivors from the Corbyn era write to talk about a purge, how many of his supporters will actually be left?
I do think it absolutely is a purge. If you look at the shadow cabinet right now, there is no one from the proper left of the party, like not a single person, which is quite striking. And I think the party is kind of meant to be a broad church. Like, you do have some people like Louise Haig and Lisa Nandy who are from the kind of traditional soft left of Labour, but there's no one properly left wing. So no, I think there's. I don't see a world in which Keir Starmer will suddenly wake up once he gets in and is like, psych!
You don't think it would be sensible for him
Johnny
to bring...
McDonnell, come back in.
You don't think it would be sensible for him to bring in a couple of people from the left of the party to try and keep things
I think it absolutely would be. If we look at what happened in Chingford with Faiza Shaheen, the fact that she was deselected, I thought that was very odd, because even taking an entirely cynical view, she was actually a very strong candidate, had been fighting in Chingford, campaigning in Chingford for a very long time, was broadly liked, etc. Even if Lotto didn't like her, surely you keep her in, because then that gives you, armour where people go, oh, but there's, no one on the left. And you can go, hey, we have one entire Faiza Shaheen from the left of the party who's still standing. And I think that showed that their political instincts are not always great, to be like, oh, we're just going to pick up this massive fight for no reason. And the rumour is that they also wanted to get rid of other kind of left-wing Labour MPs like Absana Begum in London, etc. But then, again, predictably, we're like, oh, wow, people hated it when we deselected Faiza, so we probably don't have the political capital to get rid of more. So I don't think they will be using the kind of left flank of the party at all. And I think it's probably going to come back to bite them in the arse at some point.
Seth, are there new Labour era people who could make a return? I mean, the obvious candidates would be in the Lords right now. Maybe Peter Mandelson.
Yes, I mean, the thing to remember about Peter Mandelson is he's never entirely gone away.
He's actually in the room with us right now.
he's smiling.
He is always in the room with us. Yes. No, but the serious point you make is, yes, absolutely, the House of Lords would be that point where actually the Labour peers have been at the forefront of opposition to the Conservatives, far more so because of the likelihood of being able to defeat Conservative legislation over the last few years. So, yeah, I can imagine a few Blair-era figures, but none of the sort of big names.
We've reached the end of the show, so what are the stories that have gone under the radar this week? Seth, what have you noticed?
I've been enjoying that wonderful phenomenon you see in this kind of election where a government is in the retreat, the chicken run, where an MP for a very, very marginal constituency decides to step down there and then a few weeks later pops up in an ultra-safe constituency as the newly adopted candidate. There have been 5 or 6 Conservative ministers, mainly in the north of England, who've cropped up in the south. But let me just focus on one particularly interesting case. It's related to actually one MP who's sticking by his seat. That's Tom Hunt. Tom Hunt represents Ipswich, a classic marginal constituency that he will probably lose this election. Tom Hunt was very tempted to go for the neighbouring seat of Central Suffolk and North Ipswich because the incumbent Tory MP defected to the Labour Party last month. And very late in the day he pulled out because he heard that the chairman of the Conservative Party, Richard Holden, was on the shortlist for that. There was a whole lot of animosity. The chairman of the Conservative Party then withdrew from the shortlist, and Tom Hunt decided to go somewhere else entirely, which was a very safe Tory seat in Essex, Basildon and Billericay. Basildon and Billericay has actually been looking for a new Tory candidate for the last 6 months. They've been advertising since December, and even on Tuesday night they were screaming over the phone at Conservative headquarters saying, for the love of God, will you send us someone? And being told you will definitely have a shortlist of 3. But because they left it to the last minute, under the rules, the Conservatives can impose a shortlist of 1 if it's only 48 hours before the deadline. And the shortlist of one came up. And strangely enough, it's the chairman of the Conservative Party, Richard Holden, who is no longer standing in Durham Northwest. He's now standing there. Surprise,
he had
surprise.
such strong links to Northwest Durham as well. It's so strange.
Marie, how about you?
So mine, actually, I'm going international. I don't know how under the radar it is, but I think that people have been focusing on the election a bit. So some good news from abroad. Mexico elected its first ever female president. Claudia Sheinbaum is also the first ever Jewish president of Mexico. She's a former climate scientist. She's left-wing. She's a former mayor of Mexico City and just seems to be really great, which is a really nice, I think, kind of like hopeful story, because I think Mexico has not been in the best place for some time now. Although I will say the caveat is that reading about that, because I was like, oh my God, like what nice news. I'm going to read about this to cheer myself up. And then further down the story, there was the fact that, so there's one of these massive US type selection where like lots of people get elected at lots of level. But still, over 30 candidates got killed during the campaign. And it was like, oh okay, so...
Yeah, she's got a job on her hands.
But
basically.
still, yeah, go Sheinbaum.
Well, I'm going to choose something which has nothing really to do with the election, because it's on a subject that never gets mentioned during elections, which is the state of the courts. And it's very wonky, so I apologise for that. But on the other hand, it's very short. It's a lovely report that Court Watch London, which is run by an outfit called Transform Justice, which are very good, have put out, where they basically sent a few dozen people into courts, in magistrates' courts in London, and said, tell us what you find, tell us what you see and what's going on. And the report appropriately is called Why Are You Here?, which gives you an idea of the reception that these people got. And it's really illuminating about the state of the magistrates' courts and the justice system. And it's a brief read, so I highly recommend that. Rachel, what have you got for us?
Well, this I was surprised by this story, and nobody else seemed to be that bothered by it. But the likely next Labour government will actually stick behind forcing tech companies to hand over, to keep and release information about a child's death. So they would allow coroners to compel a tech company to release that information. And I just think that's so important, actually. It was proposed a few years ago, but fell by the wayside. I think families had kind of given up hope that it would happen. But I just think it's really important. Tech companies are having a huge impact on young people's lives.
Yeah, that they have to demand it, really. You'd think common decency would suggest that they didn't have to be sued in order to hand over that information. Yeah. And that's the show. Thanks to Rachel.
Thanks.
Marie.
Thank you.
And Seth.
Thank you.
Stick around for the extra bit after Demon is a Monster by Corner Shop, and a big thanks to our generous supporters, new and old. You could join them and get the podcast early and without ads, plus lots more. Search Oh God What Now Patreon to find out how. We'll see you next time.
Hello, and many thanks from me for diverting some of your disposable income our way to Lee Thacker, Keith, Jerry Steele, Barefoot Duck, and Jason McCrossan.
Greetings from me, and a huge thank you to David Tanner, Ricardo and Mouse Insua Kao, Stephen Walsh, James and Paul Heedis.
And finally, many, many thanks and a big shout from me to Jim Nolan, Graham Sage, and returning Patreons back from the wilderness in time for the final conflict, Doug Butcher, Catherine Robinson and Gregor Shepherd.